I'm Melinda McClymans. I'm the Assistant Director of the Middle East Studies Center here at The Ohio State University. And you're in for a treat. We have a special guest here, Dr. Al-Azm from Shawnee State University, who's actually, he is an expert in saving cultural heritage. That's his main focus. And he's also a regional expert. So we're really fortunate that he was able to make it on this date. And we have an entire panel of experts for you. And it's basically going to start with an overview of extremist activities and extremist groups over the centuries in the Middle East. To give you that historical perspective, and then it's going to go into the specific groups that are on the rise now in the Middle East, and then we'll have commentary basically looking at global affairs and how this fits in. Okay, so that's sort of what you can expect, and we hope to engage a lot. So the speakers are going to really be concise, which is great. It takes actually a lot of work to prepare a concise lecture. It takes a lot of knowledge to be able to do that. So, so I really appreciate the speakers' willingness to prepare that way for us. And we're allowing time for Q&A. So try to think of questions as they're talking and save them up toward the end, because we will have a Q&A. And I'm just going to give you their biographical information to get started, and then I'm going to ask them to come up and speak. This event is co-sponsored by the Middle East Studies Center and the Mershon Center, and I just want to say thank you to Richard Herrmann, the director of the Mershon International Security Studies Center, for partnering with us to make this event possible. And the director of our center is another panelist, and I'm just thanking them both on this occasion for providing this opportunity for learning about this really current topic. I'm going to just start with the director of the Middle East Studies Center's bio. He'll be the first speaker. He is the director of the Middle East Studies Center here at Ohio State, and he's served as the director for the past 30 years. He's also a senior teaching member of the International Studies Program in the Near Eastern Languages and Cultures Department. He's a liaison for the Office of International Students and Scholars and a member of the University's International Programs Task Force. Born and raised in Afghanistan and previously a holder of government and academic positions in Kabul, he speaks Pashto, Dari, and Urdu with native fluency. He was Director General of Cultural and Foreign Relations and a professor at Kabul University before the Soviet invasion in 1979. And he was also awarded an ambassadorship, which he turned down in 2006. So we're very lucky to have him at Ohio State, because he definitely has had opportunities in Afghanistan, but has stayed here for personal and professional reasons. So very glad about that. I'm just going to make it very brief. There's a lot more I could say, but his PhD is in political science and higher education. He also has a master's in political science, and he got those from Indiana University. His master's he has another master's in higher education from Indiana University, and his bachelor's is in political science and Islamic law from Kabul University. Okay, and then Dr. Al-Azm, actually he just received an award. There's a publication called The Good 100. It honors people who are acting right now, tackling pressing global issues in extraordinary and innovative ways. And he received that recognition for the work he's doing to preserve cultural heritage of Syria, particularly antiquities. Is that correct, Dr. Al-Azm? Yes, okay. So I got that right. He was educated in the UK, reading Archaeology of Western Asiatics at the University College of London, and he graduated with a doctoral degree in 1991. He was the director of scientific and conservation laboratories at the General Department of Antiquities and Museums from 1999 to 2004, and taught at the University of Damascus until 2006. From 2006 to 2009, he became a visiting assistant professor at Brigham Young University, and currently is associate professor of Middle East history and anthropology at Shawnee State University in Ohio. Whilst working in Syria, Amr al-Azm was a first-hand observer and sometime participant of the reform processes instigated by Bashar al-Assad, thus gaining insights into how they were enacted and why more often than not they failed. Furthermore, he is an outspoken member of the Syrian opposition and a keen follower and commentator on current events in Syria and the Middle East in general. He has appeared in Syria as an expert on leading television networks, including CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, PBS, and his voice can be heard regularly on NPR. He has written articles in numerous journals and major media outlets, including guest editorials for the New York Times and Time magazine. He is a founder and a board member of the Day After Project and currently manages the Heritage Protection Initiative for Cultural Heritage Protection at the Day After Project. He is also a member of ASOR Cultural Heritage Initiatives team. So we're obviously really lucky to have him here. And Dr. Richard Herrmann, he's interim director of the Mershon Center, and he's chair of the Department of Political Science here at Ohio State University. He's written widely on security affairs, international relations, and foreign policy. He is author or editor of 3 books, including Transnational Identities, Becoming European in the EU, edited with Thomas Rees and Marilyn Brewer, 2004. Ending the Cold War, Interpretations, Causation, and the Study of International Relations, edited with Richard Ned Liebow in 2004. Perceptions and Behavior in Soviet Foreign Policy, 1985. Herrmann has also published more than 30 articles and book chapters. His work has appeared in such journals as American Political Science Review, International Organization, International Security, and World Politics. From 1990 to 1995, he was co-editor of International Studies Quarterly, a flagship journal of the International Studies Association. Besides his scholarship, Herrmann also has a wealth of practical experience. From 1989 to 91, he was a member of Secretary of State James Baker's policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State. From 92 to 95, he worked with the U.S. Information Agency to hold conflict resolution workshops for scholars and policymakers from India, Pakistan, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, Egypt, Algeria, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the United States. And in 1996-1997, he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations of New York State Task Force that introduced the book Differentiated Containment, Rethinking U.S. Policy in the Gulf. Herrmann received the Faculty Award for Distinguished University Service in 2008 and was named Joan Huber Faculty Fellow in College of Social and Behavioral Sciences from 2007 to 2010. He received a National Science Foundation grant for Understanding Global Tensions, a Sociology and Political Science workshop with Catherine Meyer in 2004. And he is the recipient of fellowships from the Harriman Institute, Ford Foundation, and Mellon Foundation. And I also happen to know that he is an engaging professor and that he does simulations in his classes that of sort of UN and conflict resolution that the students really love, and he's one of the teachers that makes Ohio State kind of a great teaching and cutting-edge research university at the same time. So without any further ado, would the panelists please join us at the front, and we're going to start with Dr. Payind with historical overview. Just, yeah.
Thank you very much, Melinda. I would like to thank the organizers, sponsors, and participants of today's symposium, and I would like to thank every one of you for coming today this late. And there is a Persian proverb that without good listeners, there will be no good singers. So I do not know, we will try to be good singers today, so that you are the ones that will really stimulate us. I would like to divide my brief presentation in 2 small segments. First, a brief background of extremist actions carried out by states and non-state entities or groups in the Middle East. And the second small segment will be jihadi groups since the 10-year Soviet occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, followed by the United States intervention in both Afghanistan and Iraq, especially in Iraq, to Afghanistan. The American troops went to Afghanistan right after September the 11th. September the 11th, 2001 was the terrorist acts in the United States. And on October the 7th, less than a month later, American and coalition forces went to Afghanistan and removed Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. So that's since then. The histories of the peoples, nations, and empires of the Middle East are replete with examples of extreme violence committed against each other and against outsiders. Some of these extremist acts committed either by states or by non-state entities were inspired by defensive motives. Others were sought to ensure the predominance of a group's or a country's culture and faith over the others. According to many Middle Eastern and European historians, I would just name few of them, Al-Tabari, Habibi, Mark Burgess, and Mark Juergensmeyer. According to them, religion and violence have had symbiotic relationship since before the Crusades and even since before the Bible. They argue that religiously motivated violent conflicts have been responsible for the vast majority of large-scale terrorist acts against civilians. So this is seen is the Middle East. A review of the histories of the followers of the three major Abrahamic religions originated in the Middle East: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So when we study their history, we are informed by the histories of these three Abrahamic religions, the followers of these three Abrahamic religions, that all of them have committed religiously motivated violence at the state and at the group level. The perpetrators of the violence often use their religious scriptures, clerical support, and apocalyptic images of destruction to justify their acts. I will just go a little bit faster here. Major examples of the extreme violence committed by states in the Middle East are listed by scholars. They're the actions of the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, under the pharaohs, Assyrians, Hebrews, Babylonians, Persians, Macedonians, pagan Romans, Christian Romans, Muslim Arabs, Mongols, Ottoman Turks. They all have committed in one shape or other violence and terrorism in the Middle East. Many of them in the name or the cause of Yahweh, Lord, or Allah. In my lifetime, the British, French, and the Soviet Empire and Nazi Germany, before, during, and after the war, have committed atrocities in the countries, outside their countries. These were state-sponsored terrorism. Now, these were state-sponsored. States were involved. Then I will go now to the major non-state entities and groups in the past in the Middle East. One can go to a group, the first century AD Jewish zealots to fight for God against Romans, Christian Crusaders Knights from 1099, the Crusades, to 1302 AD, Muslim Kharijites. Kharijites were a group of Muslims in the 7th century after the 4th Caliph, which Ali was the 4th Caliph after Prophet Muhammad. In his time, a war broke out between the two rival groups, and the Kharijites were the ones who rejected the Ali's follower and at the same time the Muawiyah's follower. So that's why the Kharijites are the ones who went out. So they rejected both the Shiite, which later became Shiites, and the Sunnis. These groups became terrorists, and one of them, by the name of Abdurrahman Muljim, assassinated the 4th Caliph Ali in his home while he was praying. Another Muslim group, which were the Ismaili Shiites, the Qarmatians, in the 8th century AD, they committed atrocities and also rebelled against the Abbasid Empire at the time. Then the third major Muslim group was the Assassins or Hashashins. This was also a group who revolted against the Sunni Seljuks. They even poisoned what is one of the springs in Mecca, and also they stole the black stone of the Mecca, which are some sort of sacred stones for the Muslims. So these were some of the groups that I just mentioned. These were the, again, non-state entities. In the post-World War II era, these are listed as extremist violent groups in the Middle East. Irgun, the Stern Gang, PLO, Arab Commandos, Black Septemberist groups. So these are some of those, the major groups that which have been listed by scholars as the terrorist non-state entities in the Middle East. Now I will go to the current major active jihadi groups in the Middle East. Hezbollah is a Shia terrorist group supported by Iran, which is very active in Lebanon and now in the Syrian civil war. Egyptian Islamic Jihad, Al-Qaeda, Afghan Taliban, and another branch of the Afghan Taliban, which are the Haqqani network. Pakistani Taliban are the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which is the Pakistani Taliban movement. So the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistani Taliban, these are the two different groups. ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, are the Arabic acronym for that is, if some of you have studied Arabic, it's a Dal, Aleph, Ain, Shin, which is the Dawlatul Islamiyya fi Iraq wa Sham. And Sham is sort of the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Jabhatun Nasra is the Front of Nasra, which is an Al-Qaeda linked group. Boko Haram in Nigeria. It is a little bit outside the heart of the Middle East. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is also linked with Al-Qaeda. And Sipahi Tayyiba in Pakistan. Pakistan has many groups, but this is one of the major ones, which is listed by scholars and also by the governments as terrorist groups. The 10-year Soviet occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989 contributed to the rise of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. These are the Mujahideen groups which President Reagan in 1982. The Mujahideen groups, this is after the Soviet invasion. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979. And as the tradition in Afghanistan was, so majority of Afghans, the ones who could afford, took up arms and fought against the Soviet Union. And they could not do, they did not have the weapons, they did not have the training, they did not have the education. So that they were supported by outsiders, especially the United States, oil-rich Arab countries, and Europeans. They all supported these resistant forces in Afghanistan. Mujahideen. These are Mujahideen. Even they were so loved by President Reagan that in 1982, one of the space shuttle, Columbia, was named after the Mujahideen. So they were freedom fighters, and stingers were given to them, and money and all sorts of things. Pakistan became very rich, became a conduit to supporting these Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And what happened when the Soviet Union, after 10 years, in February of 1989, from 1979 to 1989, almost 10 full years, the Soviet Union left Afghanistan. And so did Americans and Arabs and others. They abandoned Afghanistan. And there was a power vacuum created in Afghanistan. That power vacuum was filled by later Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and international narco-terrorist groups. Just the statistics that I have about Afghanistan. When I was growing in Afghanistan, you could not see the poppy fields. Rarely, you will probably, in a very contained area, there will be some poppy fields. And American satellites will capture that picture. And the State Department of the United States will send this to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan. I know this because I worked there. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Afghanistan will send that to the Ministry of Interior. The Ministry of Interior, those were the days that Afghanistan had a central government and police and military. The Ministry of Interior will send this to the local governor that, well, there is a poppy field. The picture has been gotten by American satellites. And quickly the police and others will go destroy those fields. Then I was in Afghanistan this last September. Wherever you go and there is a place that you can irrigate, it's a poppy fields. Poppy fields are beautiful when they are blossoming, so I went and saw those. Afghanistan is now producing 97% of the world raw opium. which is converted into heroin, and it comes to the cities here in Europe. So this is now what happened in Afghanistan. This is about almost $7 billion industry, this poppy cultivation and the heroin and others. It's almost half of the GDP of Afghanistan. It's criminalizing the Afghanistan. And for the past 15 years that American troops are in Afghanistan, they have not reduced the poppy cultivation, which is what we call criminalizing the whole Afghan government, and governors and everyone is almost involved. And there are foreign cartels and others. So that's what. So the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan gave rise to the Mujahideen and later Al-Qaeda. And then the United States occupied Iraq in 2003 and contributed to the rise of the ISI at the beginning. ISI was Islamic State of Iraq and was led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was a Jordanian. He was one of those which is called the Arab Afghans. Large number of Arabs went to Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden is the most important one. Ayman al-Zawahiri is the second important one. And also this Musab al-Zarqawi, he was in Herat. I was discussing with the professor. So he was the one who learned how to use guns in Afghanistan and then came back. Many of these Arabs who came back to Afghanistan, they joined all these different groups, including ISIL and Al-Qaeda. So they are the former who learned the experience of fighting the jihadi groups in Afghanistan. So that gave birth to this ISI, which was Islamic State of Iraq. Then the combined oppression by the Shiites in Iraq, the Nouri al-Maliki government, which was established after Americans went there, he really discriminated against the Sunnis. Iraq has a Sunni population. 60% of the Iraqis are Shiites and 40% are Sunnis. So under Nouri al-Maliki, Muslims were marginalized, Sunni Muslims. And so the Sunni Muslims, they formed this ISI, which was the Islamic State of Iraq. And then when the Sunni Muslims were suppressed in Syria by Bashar al-Assad, which is also, they were Alawite, one of the Shia branches, and with the support of Russia and Iran. So now the Sunnis from Iraq and the Sunnis from Syria have combined, and then it became ISIL, which is the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. I will just end here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to come and speak, and thank you very much because I'm going to dovetail very nicely with where you kind of left off. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but I think you've given us an excellent sort of, well, given me at least, an excellent platform to launch from there. I'm going to frame this around 5 core or key issues here, and really sort of use that those 5 key points to help you begin to get a sense or an understanding of the groups that have already been sort of mentioned, at least very specifically ISIS, which is also known as ISIL, which we also call in Arabic Daesh, which means, or also often referred to as al-Dawla, which means the state. Now, for us, if we want to sort of begin to understand the rise of jihadi movements in Syria and Iraq post-2003, the original sin really is the invasion of Afghanistan first, but most key here is the invasion of Iraq. And I say this as original sin not because I'm necessarily criticizing the invasion or I'm sort of supporting the invasion. It's just because it helps us sort of, it helps provide us with this basic platform that everything else then kicks off from it. Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi, killed in 2006. He was very much a founder, a product of the Afghan experience, and then once Afghanistan was lost to the jihadi movements, they would seek a new arena to confront the United States and continue their fight. So with now the United States in Iraq right next door, right in the heart of the Arab world, as opposed to some far-flung area, literally it was almost like a red flag to a bull. It's like, come get me, I'm here. And so it was the perfect sort of staging arena for jihadis to come and test their mettle against the West and the United States in particular. The death of Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi in 2006 followed by the surge and the Sahwa, and this is just sort of basic history you're all familiar with, really almost decimated Al-Qaeda in Iraq and drove them to essentially very much to the furthest corners and underground, literally disappearing for a while. The other character I want to sort of throw in here is al-Baghdadi, a low-level cleric, really hardly ever registering on the radar when you think of the bigger names like Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, or Abu Mus'ab. But still, in a and this is Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi here, but in a interesting sort of twist of fate, al-Baghdadi is actually picked up by the Americans early on and imprisoned at Camp Booker. And there, he's considered to really not be interesting, inspiring, or really a key actor, so eventually he's released. But at Camp Booker, he also has this opportunity to meet with a lot of other individuals who are imprisoned there too, and most of these were also ex-Baathists and other more prominent, more active radical Islamists with a very strong Salafi ideology. And it is there that we also now recognize that this marriage between the Baathists, who had essentially been, let's say, thrown out of power, dispossessed of power, and were seeking some way to get back at the Americans and at the Shiites, who had been essentially instrumental in this, along with the radical Islamist groups. There you have that marriage. You have that beginning of a relationship that's going to grow into what we now know as ISIS. Now, another important landmark is 2009, when the Obama administration essentially signals, and for those of us who kind of follow this sort of stuff, do you remember that very, for me it was a very important speech that Obama makes in Cairo in 2009, all right? Most of us kind of really didn't pay much attention to it. We almost sort of ignored it. Some people made fun of it, you know, what's he going around doing? But he laid out his vision for what he thinks the Middle East should look like. And I would advise every person in this room who has an interest to go back and listen to those words, and then you will understand many of Obama's later actions with regards to events in Iraq and Syria. In a nutshell, it essentially outlines what I would refer to as a fiercely minimalist approach to the main issues of the Middle East. And another way of describing it might be, essentially a strategy of inaction as opposed to a strategy of engagement and involvement. And all of this is happening, or in a way you could say, you could argue, you're able to get away with this because the situation in Iraq was improving, the surge had worked, and effectively the U.S. was looking at Iraq and saying, well, we can begin to consider withdrawing. But this is, and now we know obviously that this was really, there were, I don't want to say catastrophic, but I would say that there were major consequences to these decisions. By a twist of fate, the Arab Spring begins in end of 2000, December 2010, and really takes off in 2011. And very quickly, Syria in 2011 descends into a state of conflict and ultimately civil war, creating a major power vacuum. And quite, as we just heard, power vacuums are the perfect incubators for the kind of activity that radical groups like. Iraq would follow very quickly after, and by 2012, we essentially have now both Assad in Syria and Nur al-Maliki in Iraq unleashing extreme violent repression, unbridled against their enemies, primarily the Sunni population, and which also happens to be, at least in Syria, the majority of the population. And in this kind of environment, this makes perfect fertile ground for radical groups like ISIS. And ISIS is not the only one. I just happen to be focusing on that one because that's the one we most commonly recognize. So when the situation in Syria offers itself as a opportunity for ISIS to begin to recover and revive itself from the terrible beating it took in Iraq as a result of the Sahwa, as a result of the surge, we see the ISIS leadership transfer its activities and begin to sort of use Syria covertly as a safe haven. Some would argue that this was in part facilitated particularly in 2012, by the Turkish government's actions, and I'd be happy to sort of answer questions and throw that into a debate side, in the discussion part. But as a result of this, the first time we really begin to see ISIS manifest itself on the ground as a force was with the surprise takeover of the city of Raqqa, a major city in Syria. You can see it here on the map, right up there. I was, in the summer of 2013, I was with a group of activists from Raqqa. We went down there. We took a look at the place. It was ripe for the picking. It really was a vacuum, no man's land. And within a few weeks of my sort of engaging with that place, ISIS had showed up. They'd taken over the city. And thereafter, it was just like a snowball. And by 2014, they've captured a large swathe of territory, both in in Syria, and then they move on back onto Iraq. In Iraq, of course, the reason why Iraq becomes a very fertile ground for them is because Nur al-Maliki is essentially doing the same thing, and ISIS is then able to go back and present itself as a protector or as a buffer against Nur al-Maliki's aggression towards the Sunni tribes that had been abandoned effectively by the United States in their haste to withdraw. A very interesting event then takes place, which comes with the taking of Mosul. This was like when it reaches sort of a peak in 2014, summer of 2014. Mosul is captured, and then here we have al-Baghdadi appear for the first time really on the public stage. And we have this famous photo of him, as you can see, giving a khutbah at the mosque of Nuruddin Zengi, and he declares the caliphate on June 29, 2014. And he chose that place for a very specific reason, because it was all about jihad. We know that Nuruddin and the mosque and the location is all laden with symbolism pertaining to jihad. Nuruddin was essentially earned his place in history as the jihadi warrior fighting against the Crusaders. And this was not something lost on al-Baghdadi, which is why he specifically chose that place. So in declaring the caliphate, he was also formally and officially declaring jihad against the West. And like its predecessor, the previous caliphate, the expansion, the caliphate would need then to be fed with a series of expansion wars that would then become the means for this caliphate to sustain itself. The more it expands, the more wealth it acquires, the more resources it acquires. The more resources it acquires, the more it is able to expand. And we all know what happened from the end of the summer of 2014 onwards. The second point I want to sort of throw out there is this widespread appeal. This is something that's often been commented on. And I'm just showing you here, this is taken from a recent publication. It was originally thrown out by the Sufan group. And you can see that the highest number of fighters comes, interestingly, from Tunisia, which is considered, in terms of the Arab Spring, the one success in democracy in the whole of the Arab Spring. Maybe the reason why it succeeded is because they exported all their jihadis. Maybe that's one way to do it. Next up the list, and at half, is Saudi Arabia. But the Saudi Arabia part is not really an accurate one, because in 2012, the Saudi, I have Saudis, colleagues and students who tell me that in 2012 and right up to early mid 2013, you were almost encouraged to go and fight in Syria. And I don't know about Iraq, but certainly in Syria, you were almost encouraged. And then after ISIS shows up, from late 2013, 2014 onwards, suddenly the gates came down, and people who had initially been able to go and do their jihadi duty were then being rounded up and taken sort of, and interrogated and so on and so forth, and it became a problem. So I suspect that figure here for 2015 looks a lot smaller, only because the Saudis then took action. The Russians, well, again, and then you can see sort of the numbers go down as you go along. Why the widespread appeal? Primarily because ISIS's message appeals to this type of disenfranchised, disaffected Muslims who for lack of a better word here, feel that nothing is being done to prevent or stop what they perceive as continuous aggression against their group or their belief or whatever, and then here is an opportunity to fight back, to strike back. And this is not different from what we saw in Afghanistan, when Afghanistan was the crucible, the arena to try yourself out, and and we see this with many other groups as well in North Africa and so on. So this is very much a pattern that we've seen before. The third point I want to sort of touch upon, financing. This is very important about ISIS, because ISIS is really almost unique in this, in that in its ability to have taken over so much territory, it also acquired a huge amount of resources. It was able to capture banks, it was able to capture large amounts of weaponry, and in so doing, basically became rich very, very quickly. And the other point about it is that they also quickly changed, in declaring themselves as a caliphate, they also declared themselves as the state and began to function as a state, effectively institutionalizing their activities. So, acquiring resources, taxation, exploitation of mineral and other sources was essentially institutionalized and intensified to maximize return. So whether it's kidnapping, ransom, oil sales, looting of antiquities, all of these were done at an institutional industrial scale, and that in turn helped essentially fund ISIS. And if anybody has any doubts about how effective ISIS is able to fund itself, this is just a horde from one site in Syria, okay, and I'll just show you. And this goes immediately, it comes out. I can see some of the archaeologists. Okay, this goes straight to the auction. This is an ISIS-sanctioned looting expedition, dug out with bulldozers. The material goes straight down to Raqqa. It's sold on auction. All payments are in cash, in foreign currency, primarily dollar, occasionally euros, and it comes out. And it's just non-stop. Finally, the fourth point is this issue of destructive ideology. It's based on the logic of managed savagery. It was originally, it came off a book written by Abu Bakr Naji in 2004, and it was embraced and really adapted to the needs of Iraq by Abu Mus'ab al-Zarqawi. And essentially, and based off that, ISIS effectively now then uses as part of its strategy and repertoire a systematic campaign of terror and destruction. It commits atrocities against people and against property, including cultural heritage property. So we use the term atrocity here to cover whether they're blowing up archaeological sites or they're killing civilians or smashing statues or destroying places like the Temple of Baal Shamin, or blowing up the Temple of Bel. All of these are essentially atrocities, and they serve one purpose and one purpose only. Their primary purpose is to demonstrate ISIS's ability to act with impunity and the impotence of the international community to respond against it. And the impunity-impotence combination is a very powerful message. It resonates really well with the small, narrow base of supporters that ISIS has. It attracts more followers. It terrorizes, intimidates the locals, makes them feel powerless, and it is ongoing. And finally, I just want to say something very briefly about this. As part of their repertoire of atrocities, they also attack places of worship. But that's a little different than when they destroy cultural heritage sites or they execute people. The destruction of cultural heritage sites and the execution of people, they see this as a resource that is exploitable. And the act of destruction is carried out for political or for essentially temporal reasons. And then they use scripture or religious explanations to justify the atrocity. The destruction of the shrine, places of religious worship, is actually done for specific religious ideology. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to allow in the questions, I can explain why this difference exists. And finally, as you can see from the map, ISIS is spreading, so our prospects, if anybody thinks that ISIS is just going to disappear off the map anytime soon, then you better be thinking again. ISIS is a manifestation of a challenge to the region, and it is a response in the absence of real viable responses to real challenges that are currently that the region currently faces, and that's why we see this now. Thank you.
Well, it's good to be here. When I first went in the government, it was 1989, and I had just written a book about the Soviet Union, its involvement in the Middle East, mostly with Iran. And so I was sent out to Iraq. I first went in 1989 in the spring to Iraq to think about what we could do with the end of the Iran-Iraq war. It was ending, and what Khomeini had just passed away, and what opportunities there might be for the United States to engage with Islam on a different level, and what opportunities there might be to engage with Iraq. And the portfolio, the way the State Department is organized, included also dealing with the Afghan Mujahideen, which I knew, whatever I knew about it was from my friend Al-Azm Payind, who I've been very lucky to have as a colleague for a long time and had taught me some about it. But I found myself, whatever that was, 25, 30 years ago, and into this issue of Afghanistan. And I would have been surprised if you had told me all these years later I would have dealt with it all my adult life. And it's good to have Amr Al-Azm back. I remember talking with you 4 or 5 years ago, and unfortunately nothing good has changed in the Middle East. And unfortunately, that may be the gist of what I'm about to say. In the 30 years I've been watching this, it's hard to see progress in American diplomacy in the Middle East, or frankly, for that matter, economic and political development in the Middle East since then. And I think that that's a sobering place to start. I want to, how do I move this forward, Stephen? Is it, I'm here? Yeah. Okay. I want to make 3 points tonight. And I don't know nearly as much about Syria and Afghanistan as the 2 people who spoke before. So I'm not going to try to delve deeply into all of what they've talked about. But I want to talk at first and mostly about how I think Americans in the West more generally see and think about violent groups that we call jihadi. And I've been thinking about this over a lot of decades now, and so I want to start with how do we think about this and how do we parse it out, because I think our thinking about it is often quite confused. And then I want to talk about what the United States can do, and particularly some thoughts about power and leverage. And maybe that explains partly why things haven't gone very well. And last, I want to talk about what's necessary, or what kind of foundations would be needed to produce any kind of developments that would have any lasting and persisting value. Because again, as you look across what we thought were momentary successes, whether it was the Russian leaving Afghanistan when I first got involved, it was because the Soviet Union pulled out in 1987 and we were thinking about the resolution of the war. By 1989, well, it's only gotten worse, obviously, and so on.